It is live now.
Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce you to this next keynote. This keynote will be presented to us by Mark Plettenberg. He's based out of Amsterdam and currently walking around the office in his socks, so he doesn't make too much noise for the microphones in the room. Mark is a former consultant and one of the original developers of Login VSI. Mark has intimate experience with all performance-related aspects of VDI and server-based compute. And I will be on here as a panelist to answer any questions during the presentation. If we have time at the end, we will certainly address some of them. If you have any further questions, you can always stop by our booth in the expo hall and ask at the booth. And so for the next 45 minutes, Mark, the floor is yours, please enjoy.
Thank you so much, Blair, for this introduction. And I am indeed wearing socks to be quiet because it's a very well laminated office, a lot of bouncy surfaces. Thanks everybody for joining today. I'm happy to have you here. If all is well, you should be seeing my screen that says very big, the VDI Performance Summit and the impact of change. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. What is the impact of a change on your VDI environment? Because honestly, we all have to do a lot of changes in our environment, and it's more by the day. But are they good or bad for performance? And we never really know that until we find out in production that something is maybe wrong or not working the way we expected anymore, or when we are getting those support tickets. And honestly, that's a little bit late. So I'm going to give you some tips and tricks on how you can prevent that. I'm going to show you through the test lab on how we validate performance and scalability. And I'm also going to take you through the year 2018, which was very interesting when it comes to performance, with a lot of stuff on a hardware level, which was new to a lot of us that were only doing performance tuning and testing on the software level. So to understand what I'm doing and where I'm coming from, I have to explain a little bit about the test lab first. So how do I test and what I'm going to be talking about for the next 40 minutes or so. And it's actually surprisingly simple. I mimic user behavior. The only thing I don't have in my lab, of course, are real users. I can't just call out to 1,000 people like, hey, would you be so kind to log on, in a perfectly stacked order with 30 seconds intervals to my environment until it breaks. So we invented a long time ago virtual users. And I log on these virtual users to my environment one by one. Now, as one of the characteristics of a virtual desktop environment, and when I say VDI, I really mean server-based computing as well, everything where users are remoting into a centralized environment, whether it's an on-prem or a data center environment. So I log on users to the environment, and at some point, of course, the environment starts to get full, and performance goes down for all of the users that are currently on the environment, not just the ones that have logged on last. Now, this is a characteristic that a lot of people are unaware about, but is very relevant when you're doing scaling and sizing estimates. This is also why you should test at full scale. Now, if you keep on continuing to push users to that system, at some point the system will be overloaded. And we came up with a name for this. This is what we call the VSI max. This is the maximum performance, the maximum number of users that can comfortably work on a system without getting into performance troubles. And this number is very important because it allows me to easily perform comparisons between test A and test B. Let's say I want to know what the impact is of installing antivirus. I run a test, test A, I get my VSI max. I run a test again, I get my VSI max. I compare the two, and I have basic information on how the environment will perform. I will go through a little bit more numbers that come out of VSI automatically that give you insights on performance, so making it easier for you to compare. I'm also going to show you some of the worst case examples that we've seen in practice, so you don't have to figure out, am I doing it right or wrong here? But I do have to say, these numbers are produced in a lab, so the mileage will vary. I can do all of the optimizations that I want. I can disable anything I want, but in practice, you might want to keep search and indexing on. You might want to keep your antivirus on, not turn it off because it's good for performance. So what do I use to test? I'm very fortunate. I have got a Cisco HyperFlex lab. So I got 3 240Cs, a few fabric interconnects, a lot of storage. And as in the typical enterprise, my environment the bottleneck is typically CPU, right? Storage is no problem here. Networking is no problem with just 3 nodes. As is very common, it's typically CPU. Of course, we also have GPUs to do tests with that, and I can make a mix of different environments. As a hypervisor, we typically use VMware ESX. On top of that, we've got Citrix XenApp or XenDesktop, or as it's now called, Virtual Apps and Desktops. We got a mixture of operating systems where it can be a server operating system or a desktop operating system, and different versions of Microsoft Office. And if I make a mix out of that, I can do tests and figure out the performance. And the performance, even within this matrix, which is just basic operating system on basic hardware, is already a big influence on performance. And I'm just getting started, because from our research, we know that actually involving the real applications into the mix will have the biggest distinction when it comes to performance problems. Now, if you want to know more about the Cisco stuff, join the session by Brian, which is later today at 3:15 EST or EDT, about the Cisco platform. So why is it important to test? And how do you test? Because I was talking about testing scale, right? Scale testing is really what you do for planned changes, right? You know you're going to migrate maybe from Windows 10 1607 to 1703 or 1709 or even more recent. But you also have unplanned changes. Those security leaks that you need to patch for quickly, that you don't have the time to test, you bring them to production, but you still want to know what happened, right? So that requires a different approach. And I will talk about that in detail a little bit later. Unplanned changes are also what happens when another department changes, for example, the configuration of your storage, right? If you're not in control of the full stack of running your virtual desktops, often I see that, somebody changes something, you were not aware of that, and the performance for the real users is affected, or you can't make the scalability numbers anymore. So let's start with the easiest example, right? Almost every enterprise runs Microsoft Office for at least a part of their users. So I'm not going to go into specific software for healthcare or finance, although that's very interesting. The default applications are already giving us challenges enough. So Office 2019, who is using Office 2019 already? We can see that if we look at the VDI-ikeAPRO data, most customers today, as expected, are running Office 2016, which is great. A large quantity of that is also done via Office 365. In theory, that means that you're evergreen, so that you could already move to Office 2019 already, but in practice, people, of course, have not made the jump yet. We can also see that the real Office 2013 volume license edition, or whatever you want to call it, is just about below 2%. So that gives an indication. And I want to ask you, because you probably have not done this, if you would implement and go from, let's say, Microsoft Office 2016 to 2019 in your environment today, do you think you will get more or less users on the same environment, right? So I'm doing 2 tests. I have my VDI environment, Windows 10, Office 2016, and I got my environment with Windows 10 and Office 2019. In which scenario can I run more users on one host in this example? Will it go up or will it go down? A little bit more background information. From Office 2010 to 2013, we saw performance and scalability decrease. From 2013 to 2016, we saw performance decrease. So naturally, we also assumed that from 2016 to 2019, it would decrease. But to our surprise, we saw that it increased. Not significantly, it increased a little bit, but still, Microsoft is onto something good here. And this, of course, is related to how Microsoft releases software now. Office 2016, with all of the patches, is very similar to Office 2019 at the moment of release. Of course, this will change again over time, but today results are very similar. And that's also what we see if we look at one of the charts. This is where I plotted the CPU. So on the horizontal axis, we can see the time I took to test. So typically a test is just an hour, so it's really quick. You can do that, you can do multiple tests in one day even. And on the vertical axis, the y-axis, we can see that as I slowly log on more users, I'm using more CPU cycles, right? And at some point I will hit 100%. Now for Office 2016 and 2019, these patterns are very similar. So that's good. Good job, Microsoft, because there's no big impact there. And if there's an impact, it's making us happy. Now, 2018 was for me a very new year. I learned a lot about how CPUs and memory and caching work. I never really bothered to know a lot about the hardware because I could do plenty of stuff in performance tuning in just the software. However, the recent security flaws and mitigations that have come into place have forced me, but also you probably, to reconsider the scalability of your VDI environment. In some scenarios, I've had customers that have lost over 50% scalability of the environment. To put it mildly, that's not great if you want to keep your job. So how can you still implement these security patches and be sure of how it impacts the performance before you go live? Or also to convince your security officer, like, hey, I know you want to patch for Meltdown Inspector, but hey, this is what it's going to cost the organization. I need more hardware. You can now prove that to your security team or to upper management. Now, as I said, we had a lot of CPU flaws. And to refresh your mind, it all started with Meltdown Inspector. I think it was the 5th or the 6th of January last year. And while the big parties already knew about it about half a year, this was dropped into the wild. It even made the evening news. And that was also something new for me, right? A leak in a CPU making the evening news, telling us that we should do something about it, but also that there will be a performance impact. Unfortunately, it didn't stop there. After that, we got L1TF, or foreshadow as it's known, because all of these exploits now are branded. And although it looks similar, it is a different leak. So the mitigations for the first, they don't work. Also, there's a difference in how they work if you have AMD or Intel CPUs. So you have to do a lot of due diligence before you can tell, is it actually affecting my environment? And how will it affect my environment? Even with foreshadow, there's different types of foreshadow, right? So you could have a very mild mitigation where you say, well, I trust all of the VMs that are standing next to me, so I'm not going to do all of it. Or you have to go for the full mitigation where you basically disable hyperthreading. Now, one that's not been a lot in the news is the spoiler leak that came out recently. It's also not great for performance, but the good thing is there is not going to be a mitigation. Now, this is not good news if you're a security officer, but I'm a performance guy and I can clearly say that's probably a good idea. Now, the reason I put this out here is that people tend to forget quickly that these leaks are there, right? And at some point, Microsoft or VMware or other vendors will put patches in their releases, mitigations for these flaws. Now, typically they're not enabled by default, but sometimes they are. So on screen right now, you can see some trends of how quick people forget about certain things. So this is a Google Trends overview for Meltdown Inspector, L1TF, and also for the spoiler flaw. You, by the way, really have to look for spoiler flaw, because spoiler is a pretty popular word on the internet, especially with Game of Thrones and other things coming out. So that's a weekly spike. If you want to know about security flaws, just add flaw and you will get the perfect graph showing you how fast people stop looking for this. And that's not a very good idea, because without the shadow of a doubt, there will be more of these flaws. And you better be prepared in your environment to test what the impact will be for you, A, from a security perspective, but B, also from a sizing and scalability perspective. I'm not in the loop on any of this, but I can almost guarantee that there will be more leaks uncovered, because these leaks, these flaws are really a type of leak. So it's not just a leak, it's a fault in the hardware. These can be mitigated with software at a performance penalty, but ultimately you really need new hardware with better fixed, architectures. Now, the good thing is that over time, software vendors are also improving their mitigations. Now, VMware introduced ESXi 6.7 Update 2. In there, they've got a better scheduler for mitigating foreshadow. So this is really nice. At first, they told you better disable hyperthreading, basically, but they made a smarter schedule for that, but the relative effect was the same. Now with Update 2, they said, hey, we got something new for you here. We found a more efficient way to do this mitigation. Here you have it. So kudos to them, because also other vendors, they say, well, disable hyperthreading and your life will be good. So let's dive into Windows 10 for a second and Meltdown Inspector, right? If you look on screen right now, you can see what the impact of a hotfix is on Windows 10. And the great thing about Meltdown Inspector is that the newer the operating system, but also the newer the CPU, the newer the hardware in general, the less the impact will be. So on Windows 10, we only saw a downgrade of about 6% in performance. Now, the good thing is I could counter this by doing performance tuning, right? If you do not know about performance tuning, you're going to learn all about it today. Don't worry about it, because if I would tune my performance, my environment, rather than just 130 users, I will get 142 users on it out of the bat, making it a better performance out of the box, and only lose 3% after patching for Meltdown and Spectre, as you can also see in the chart. Now, I've done the same for Windows 7, and unfortunately, what you see then is that you lose a lot more. Like I said, Windows 7 has the side effect of being an older operating system and therefore losing more performance. So you see here on the left, scalability of Windows 10, on the right of Windows 7, and relatively they lose a bit more. However, good news, Windows 7 does fit more machines on a machine to start with, because it uses less RAM, CPU, and other resources. So that's good. And that was Meltdown and Spectre. And also what you have to think about is that with Meltdown and Spectre, we saw that it had a certain effect on VDI. With Foreshadow, it had that effect on server-based computing. So what works for one patch or mitigation, it could completely mean the opposite for the other. So I'd really like to advise you to do some testing before you go live. Also when you're in the cloud, because if you're in the cloud guys are going to be patching for you, right? You don't have a choice. If you're on Azure, if you're on Google Cloud, if you're on AWS, they patch at a certain moment because they have all the untrusted VMs. They got to patch in the most stringent way, and you're going to notice. Maybe not scalability, what Ruben talked about, but definitely you will measure it in the single user performance. And in Azure now, the mix, of course, has become more interesting with Windows 10 multi-session, right? You again have one big host that will be affected if you do something. So what are the recommendations per vendor? VMware says, well, consider enabling the side channel aware scheduler. These are really good sentences, by the way, for a non-native English speaker to practice. What I like is that it's not enabled by default. This is really good because it allows you to still do performance tests with it flipped on and off. So that makes my life a lot easier. Now, the V1 performance impact of that is similar to disabling hyperthreading. If you look at the documentation of VMware, they say you lose about 33% scalability. In practice, by testing and looking at the customers, we see that it's more of around 22%. But still, if you lose 22% of the scalability of your environment, you might not be happy. Now, the side channel aware scheduler V2 that was introduced recently in 6.7 update 2 makes it better, right? It is less of a performance overhead, but we just have to determine still how good it will be. Now, Citrix is a bit more blunt. They say, well, disable hyperthreading. I've not seen any news on that. Not a very elegant solution, but it is a very safe solution. It does work. The downside, however, is that this is really something that you have to program in the BIOS. So it's not something they can roll back with an update like VMware did. So I have to give points to VMware here for coming up with a good solution moving forward. Microsoft C flowchart, they gave us an easy-to-use flowchart, of course. So this makes your life simple. But in essence, you can say, Server 2012, disable hyperthreading. Server 2016, it depends. Server 2019, there will be a aware scheduler in there. So use the flowchart and your life will be good. Now, looking at L1TF when it comes to performance loss, right? Let's get into some numbers. Server 2016, I could get, and I have to take a little peek here, almost 200 users on my machine, right? That's great. This is a multi-user scenario. Now, after patching, I lost only 10 users per server. So this is single server scalability again. So 200 losing 10 users, that's not too bad. I will probably survive that. However, looking at VDI, and I took Windows 10 1803 as it's very common in the world today, I see that right off the bat, instead of 200, I can only get 140 machines on the same hardware, which makes sense, right? It simply takes more resources to run Windows 10 for every user. But after patching, I also lose 30 users per server, so my single server scalability. And this might just be a number that is going to hurt you. So a lot of our partners, but also customers, ran into this problem in practice. And this made them reconsider, like, hey, we should really do performance testing before we go live because we want to keep our users out of trouble. Now, how can you survive the performance loss, right? What if you already have patched or you have to patch, but you literally don't know where you can get the hardware or you do not have the budget for hardware? Check out the VMware Operating System Optimization Toolkit, or OSOT in short, or the Citrix Optimizer. Both are very easy to use products that can help you optimize the system's performance in literally like under 5 minutes. What's very cool is that the creators of those tools, Hilko for VMware and Martin Zugaj for Citrix, will be doing sessions later today. So I'm really honored to have them in here because, in my opinion, a VDI environment that has not been performance tuned cannot work properly. So VDI vendors, please move more of these optimizations inside of the box. There are things that you really have to download aside from the products now, but if you, in my opinion, if you want to be successful with VDI, you do at least some sort of performance optimizations. You look really good at what the user needs, right? Don't disable search and indexing if your people like to find emails and documents. But there's a lot of stuff that you don't really need in the image that still costs performance. I'm talking about you, Candy Crush. So Windows 10, right? Let's look at Windows 10. Ruben already mentioned the survey data if you joined the first session, and he showed that Windows 10 is the most popular operating system by far. But then again, which version of Windows 10, right? There's a lot of them. And also, how often do you upgrade to a new build? Now we see that the most popular choice here is to upgrade within 1 year, which is good, right? That means that you're probably now looking at 1803, not yet at 1903, of course. We know it's out there, but realistically, you're now moving to 1803, and you're not going to 1809 just yet, which is a good thing, because as an enterprise, you don't want to go first with these releases, right? There have been some problems with 1809, and we're going to have to see if 1903, I'm sorry, so many numbers, can live up to the dream of being flawless, right? It alternates good, bad, good, bad. Now, let's look at some single server scalability numbers for these Windows 10 builds. Windows 10 1607, I could get 150 users as single server scalability, right? One server. Again, after performance tuning. After performance tuning, running a test with 1703, again, took me 1 hour. I got 154 users on the same hardware. By the way, these charts go the other way if you do not do performance tuning, right? Performance will always go down with every update. 1709, I got 156 users on the same machine. At this point, we were really excited. Microsoft found a good way to do releases. They increased performance or scalability for every release, and we were very happy until we saw 1803. It went down, and it went down significantly. Now, to be honest, it's not really Microsoft to blame for this one. This one we really have to thank Intel. We went down to 134 users, really because of Meltdown and Spectre, right? If you do the mitigations as recommended by the vendors, you will lose users per server, as we've just proven in the previous segment of this presentation. So that's interesting. Microsoft can't really do anything about it, but you will get less users on the server. So for you, it's not really relevant whose fault it is. You're going to have to deal with it. Now, with 1809, it dropped even more. So 1809, we were not too happy when we saw this release, and I will show you in a minute what happened, because when we started testing, the actual VSI max was somewhere around 5. So going from 156 to 5 users in a year's time worth of updates is less than ideal, in my opinion. So let's look at why that happened. I've got here the CPU utilization of every build of Windows 10. And in this case, the previous ones were tested on ESX. This test has been done on the Citrix hypervisor, but in my opinion, the hypervisor doesn't really have a big impact on performance anymore. You have to look at things like price and management, and other factors. So starting at 1607, adding all of the builds, and suddenly we see 1809 with the CPU utilization there. Even to the untrained eye, I can see that something is wrong and it's using too much CPU here. So what's wrong? What happened here? I changed one little thing, and now the green line has appeared. That's also Windows 10 1809. I removed OneDrive from the image. Now, this is not something I recommend, nor is it something that Microsoft recommends, but it does save me a lot of CPU cycles. So I don't know why it is, but OneDrive, during the logon phase, decides to index all of the files in my desktop. Imagine I'm logging on 150 users to one server. It breaks the performance completely. So removing OneDrive from the image saved me a lot of CPU cycles here. So that was interesting. And it's also something that cost us some time to figure out. Now, this is not something you just only see in CPU utilization. You always also see it in the average logon time. And that's something your real users will also experience, right? So again, we start at 1607. I slowly add more Windows 10 builds to the chart so you can see how it builds up. And again, 1809 comes into play, right? Even to the untrained eye, I can clearly see that I do not want to just give this to my users without doing performance tuning. Less than ideal. Removing OneDrive again, we get the green line, and we see that even though I'm still using a little bit more CPU than I was with Windows 10 before, it's significantly less than with OneDrive. And remember, this is just a default application that we've got within Windows, right? I'm not talking about your Cerner or SAP or line of business application that's critical to you, that you need to upgrade. This is something that you get for free when you upgrade Windows with a new version. Now, I've isolated just 1803 and 1809, and the difference is just staggering, where you can see that already at 70 users, logon times are going through the roof. So, looks like a simple task, right? Let's remove OneDrive from the image. So I open my Programs and Features wizard, and I press Uninstall. You reboot and log on a user, it's back. So I've made a little guide on how to actually remove OneDrive, because that took me more than 10 minutes, which is silly for removing an application. So what do you have to do to remove OneDrive? First of all, you have to kill OneDrive and Explorer.exe as running processes. Fair enough. Now you have to remove the setup files from your sys32 folder. Because, oh, by the way, yeah, your setup files live in the sys32 folder. I don't know why they are there, but they are there. Then you set registry keys to disable OneDrive. Or if you have a big boy network, you can do it via group policies. There are local machine keys. Because we're nice guys, we also remove the OneDrive icons from the Explorer sidebar. We remove the OneDrive setup from the active setup for new users. So that's the mandatory profile for the users. I don't know why, but it is here. I guess that malware writers are looking at this, like, oh, these are good advices. This is how we can get software into the enterprise. Also, we remove the start menu entries, and we take ownership of the OneDrive folders and remove all write permissions. Now, to be honest, the last one wasn't really necessary, but I was so frustrated at this point already that I just added it because I could. Now, if you do want to do this in your environment, I don't recommend it. OneDrive is also coming out with a new multi-user client, by the way, that should fix a lot of the performance deficiencies. But if you want to do this, I've got a nice little PowerShell script for you. Put your hand up in the Q&A, and I will make sure that we send it to you after the presentation. Because it's quite a few steps, and it's funny because we're just removing an application that's standard in Windows. Now, of course, there's one more thing. And how good is it to use the Apple phrase on Windows 10 1903, right? We did test this already, and I am going to leave you hanging for a while, but let's look at this trend. Do you guys think that 1903, looking at the trend, will perform better or worse than 1809 when it comes to single service scalability? Well, the good thing is, as it looks now, it's not going to be great. I'm going to keep it a surprise because we're doing still more research into how you can make it better. We're not just the guys that tell you performance is not great. We're also the guys that want to tell you how to solve it. Nobody in practice today is moving to Windows 10 1903, I hope. So we can spare a few moments there, but keep an eye out for 1809 and 1903 when you're moving them into production. So let's go into practice mode again, right? Let's look at what a colleague of mine did at an airport recently. So it's my colleague Jasper, and he did some research at an actual customer. So we go out of my lab, we go into the field. This airport wanted to go open and go live with 400 users in their environment. And what you're looking at right now is a typical chart that you get after 1 hour of testing with VSI. It tries to log on 400 users, as you can see in the horizontal bar. And it does that over the time of about 48 minutes. In the vertical bar, you can see the response times of the systems. And as we add more users, the system, of course, becomes slower, right? It's as simple as that. At some point, the system will become too slow. And in this case, it found out that at 373 users, you should not add more users to the system because it will break. Now, again, this airport wanted to open with 400 staff at the first day. It was a completely new build airport. imagine you're one of those 27 people at a check-in gate that cannot board your flight because their VDI environment is over capacity. You're not going to have a great day. Neither is the desk attendant, of course. So that's why they tested. We came to 373. It's close, but not enough. So we started looking into why this happened. And for that, we've got the Login VSI VDI tuning stack. And it's a list of items that we use as a little cheat sheet. We keep it in the back of our pockets, or by now we really know it by heart, to figure out items that we can look into as problem areas, just so we have it as a reference. And pretty quickly we figured out that we wanted to look at a few things. The client, the VMware View client in this case, the remoting protocol, and the policies. Now you have AD policies, but you also have VMware policies, right? So VMware policies can set specific things. Now, in the results, we could see that we had a really huge CPU utilization. So we looked at the settings at both the server and the client side. And one thing that we found strange was that the frames per second were set to 60 frames per second. Now imagine the default is 30 frames per second. That's also about what the human eye can see. And at 30 frames per second, your server has to send 30 images of the screen to the client. At 60 frames per second, it has to do double the work. So, as a hypothesis, we thought this could be what causes high CPU utilization. The good thing about being able to test with these virtual users is that we can do an A/B test. We ask them, hey, do you mind if we change this setting? Do you mind if we flick it from 60 to 30 again? And they said, well, no, go ahead. We don't actually know why it's there. We just did it because a consultant said he always did it. We thought it was a good idea, but we didn't know there was an impact on performance. So this is one VMware policy. It's all it takes. And we move from 373 to easily over 400 users. Now, we didn't test above 400 because it showed that the environment was up to what the customer needed. It was way above their satisfaction. And I can see by the headroom, but I can't do any guarantees here, that there is still room to grow in this environment. I don't know how much, but there is still plenty of room here. So one little change, and this airport going live at day one, the VDI environment went from a disaster to happy users. And I think that's what everybody wants in the end, right? This is the easiest way to test, especially in new environments. You don't have users, we've got plenty. Now, another question I get a lot, and Ruben was also mentioning this during his keynote, is how relevant is performance testing in the cloud? Because with VSI, I'm definitely not going to find the performance limit of Azure or AWS, or at least we hope you will never find it with our products, because they can scale infinitely, at least to our eyes. But if I look at the cloud, I only see you moving the bottom few layers of that same VDI performance tuning stack. And Ruben is right? For VDI, you simply buy more instances. But Microsoft has surprised us with something new, right? We still need to do scalability research because now we have Windows 10 multi-user. Multi-user again means I buy one big instance and I log on a lot of users to it. So we got single user operating systems, Windows 7, Windows 8, maybe, Windows 10. You give it 2 vCPUs, 4 gigabytes of memory, and maybe a GPU, your users will be happy. If you have 1,000 users, you buy 1,000 VDIs. You still need to monitor, of course, in production continuously if these users are happy. But from a scalability perspective, you're all set. Now, with Windows Virtual Desktop, they came out with a multi-user operating system. So is it VDI? Is it server-based computing? I'm not sure. For me, it feels like server-based computing a little bit more. And that one is not the same size, but you buy a very big instance. You give it a lot of CPUs, you give it a lot of memory, but at some point, that machine will be full, right? At some point, your users will start to complain. Now, I'm happy to talk about the fact that we're doing tests together with Microsoft and have been doing so for almost the last year on Windows Virtual Desktop. So they will scale it out of the box, which is great. But we've also learned that applications are the biggest impact on performance in every environment. So how will it work out for you? What instance size should you get in your environment to make it perform well? And of course, different instance sizes also mean different prices. So if you run a big instance per hour, it could be that it's less or more cost efficient. So I'm pretty sure that Nick, who's doing a session later today, is going into, should I buy one big instance or should I buy multiple smaller instances for the best price performance combination, right? Should I do A or B? And what is it going to cost me? An easy comparison. with an easy product. You can just use VSI to log on these virtual user guys, and they will tell you exactly how performance is going on. So I promised you guys that there would be room for questions. So here it is. The chat is open. My colleagues are monitoring that. If there's interesting questions, I will see them now on screen. And I hope, by the way, also that you have enjoyed the session so far. So I do see a lot of script requests coming in. That's good. So if you want to remove OneDrive, we've got you covered with a little script. What setting about frames per second was changed from 60 to 30 that made the difference? Exactly what setting was it? So if you download the VMware View group policy setting pack, it's a separate download on the VMware website. There's a few settings per protocol if you're using BLAST, for example, or PC over IP, where you can simply limit the FPS, set that, and you're good to go. Also, if you Google like set FPS VMware Horizon View, you will find it. I don't know it by heart because there's a few too many settings there, but that'll work. There's also the question, can I test in different languages than English with Login VSI? Yes, you can. It's no problem. How long does it take to set up and do a test with Login VSI? The setup takes not very long. Let's say a couple of hours, and then every test that you want to do takes about 48 minutes to an hour. There's a question coming in, when you state the number of users per server, assuming this was VDI, not server-based computing, that depends. So I did some numbers on server-based computing, and then you can see it. Then I was talking about server 2016 or server 2019. When I'm talking about VDI, it's typically Windows 7, Windows 8, or Windows 10. Most commonly, of course, Windows 10. I have not released any numbers on Windows Virtual Desktop. Those are to come out, but first we need to finalize the testing with the teams there. Of course, Windows Virtual Desktop is in public preview, so you can also do this yourself. If you want to do continuous testing, by the way, you can use Login PI. So I spend most of my time today on scalability, but continuous testing is really important in these cloud environments because, as I said, if the cloud provider or your managed desktop provider changes something, or if you are a managed desktop provider, you're not going to see it directly in a scalability test. But you are going to notice if you leave these virtual robot user guys working 24/7, also in your most business critical line of business applications, doing the jobs, for example, at the ER, mimic an ER staff member, going into the electronic health record, looking up a patient, finding the allergies, reporting on how fast it goes. Because if the system can't do it fast enough, how can we expect, of course, a real person to do this? Now, there's a question about, is there a big performance improvement when using a VDI-friendly antivirus like McAfee Move? That's a very good question. The answer is, it depends. Now, in theory, yes, of course. In practice, most of the times as well, but you really have to configure it properly. I don't know the details, but the session after me will go into some testing we've done for the US government. It also contains antivirus results. And we've seen significant results where an antivirus solution would actually lock, two solutions would lock the same file at the same time. So these are really like edge cases that Brian is going to talk about. It's really cool that you really can't predict, right? In theory, we're all building Snowflake VDI environments. They're all unique. So what works in our lab, or what I recommend, is not necessarily the best recommendation for your VDI environment. So there's a question for CPU leaks mentioned. Only ESX 6.7 update 2 is recommended. What about 6.5 or 6.0? So depending on specific ESX versions, there are mitigations in place. So you should do a few things. Update the BIOS of the server to the latest version. That should also include the microcode updates. You can also upgrade VMware to the latest version or download security patches. They can also patch the microcode of your CPU, by the way, if you cannot touch your firmware updates of the CPU. And then, of course, you also need mitigations within the operating system. So it's a very complex set of mitigations, and some of them only start working when you have the full stack. So it's important to note that you might get a kick later on. You think you patched the firmware in the BIOS, but only when the full Windows mitigations are also there, it will become active, it will wake up, it will kick in. So you might get a surprise later on, and this actually caught a few of our customers by surprise. So Can you please indicate the impact of the tuning stack? What are the key things to improve VDI performance? What I'd recommend is start with the basics, right? Don't take an image that you have for your Fed clients and convert it to a VDI image. That's generally a bad idea. It has been from the beginning, but it's still a bad idea. Design a image specifically for your VDI. Make sure there's as less stuff in there as possible, right? You're going to have to live with antivirus. You're going to probably have to live with a workspace manager. So look at those and see which settings you don't need and which ones you can set for optimum performance. And go through that whole stack. Like, is my hypervisor tuned for VDI? Is my storage tuned for VDI? Or am I sharing that maybe with a file server? You know, can I optimize something there? It's really a step-by-step process. Is there any improvement by enabling the WEM agent for performance management in a Win 10 desktop? I can see the point in server-based computing where server-based computing sessions are shared, but what on a dedicated desktop? So again, on a dedicated desktop, the multi-user part falls off, but still the continuous testing stands. You want to know, of course, you know, is it change still good or bad? So going back to the WEM question, yes, WEM can definitely improve performance for your users. But again, it depends on your applications, right? If all of your applications take the CPU all the time, there's not a lot that WEM can do about that. So it really would be considering something to discuss with your software vendor if possible. But WEM can definitely help out. And is VSI Max based on the first time that the CPU hits 100%? Oh, good question. Or is it when it hits and stays at 100% for a certain time period? So we actually don't look at CPU utilization directly. We look at what users see, application starts and things that we do in applications. And based on that, we tell you if the performance of the system is actually good or bad. However, this correlates with CPU. So typically we see you hit VSI Max before you hit the CPU bottleneck, before it stays at 100%. Because when a system is at 100%, whether it's for CPU or for memory or for storage, it starts to queue, you get a snowball effect and performance gets worse a lot faster. All right, this ends my time. I've got big blinking red letters on my screen that I should stop. I would like to thank you very much. I'll be hanging around in the Login VSI booth Expo chat for a while. If you have further questions, feel free to visit me there. We're now going over to a virtual coffee. So this means you can either drink a virtual cup of coffee or walk to your own coffee machine and get unlimited free coffee as you want. Feel free to also get a sandwich or a piece of fruit, of course. But don't forget to visit our expo. There's vendors in every virtual booth. You can talk to them, you can chat to them, you can call them. They've got great raffles, and so you can win prizes. What's not to like? We'll be preparing here for the next speaker, which will be Brian. Brian will be telling you all about performance from the field. He's a field guy, right? So he knows a lot more about what real user experience is in the field than I do. So tune back in about 15 minutes. You got a new meeting ID, so go back into the auditorium, click in session, and with that, I'd like to thank you and see you around. Take care. Bye-bye.